Welcome to All Out on the Eastern Front. My name is Ekaterina Shengelia, or Katshengelia. I'm a master's student at King's College London. Usually, this introduction wouldn't be said by me, it would be said by our beloved co-host, Charlie Hancock. However, unfortunately, Charlie's currently, or fortunately, at the Munich Security Conference. She's abandoned us, she hates me, and, she's not going to hear this until the podcast's uploaded, but I am throwing out these accusations. However, today I'm joined by none other than Nicolas Castillo. Nicolas, I'll let you introduce yourself. Tell us who you are.
Hi, yes, sure. My name is Nick Castillo. I'm a DC-based international relations writer and researcher. I focus on Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. My day job, 9 to 5, is working at the Caspian Policy Center, which is a DC-based think tank working on this region. I also run my own Substack called the Eastern Neighborhood Bulletin, and I write in wherever I can at any given moment. But yeah, very happy to be here. Thanks for the invite, Kat.
No, you're more than welcome. So before we focus on the main topic this week, we actually have two guests, one in studio and one who will be actually recorded tomorrow. So we're recording this Thursday night, London time. And tomorrow morning, we'll have another guest, Anton Shekhovtsov. We'll talk about it more a little bit later. Before we focus on the main topic this week, that is the upcoming official commencement of negotiations between United States, Russia, and Ukraine. Let's quickly discuss the news throughout the region. So, Nick, I'll let you take the lead on this one. You have some news out of a country we didn't mention yet, and who I really don't want to mention because for some reason people from this country always tell me, as a half Georgian, that they invented our alphabet. And I really don't like these fake news and these fake accusations that are extremely Georgian-ophobic. Go ahead.
Well, first, I'll just comment on your comment. My Georgian host dad rants for like minutes at a time about the various claims leveled against a Georgian culture by Armenians. He has a lot of very strong opinions, and most Georgians I've met do.
Never ask in a crowd of Armenians and Georgians and Azeris where a certain famous person comes from, and especially in an Armenian-Georgian crowd, never and ever start talking about the genealogy and the heritage of the Bagration or Bagrationi family, bro. That is.
Or good rule of thumb also, never mention a piece of food in any context, in any conversation with any Caucasian ever. It will not go well. They're going to start yelling. It's a mess. Don't bring it up.
Nicholas is shivering. He's learned.
You don't understand. I've hung out with people from all three countries. It's a mess.
So let's start with Armenia. So bring me hot, sizzling news out of Armenia. What's going on?
Gotcha. So on February 12th, a piece of legislation passed its initial reading in the Armenian parliament, which is called the National Assembly. It passed with 63 out of 107 MPs voting in favor. The interesting thing about this legislation is that it brings something to the fore that has not really been on the radar in Armenia since 1991, and that's like a potential European Union membership application. So this piece of legislation tasks the government of Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan with working with the EU on developing a roadmap for a potential accession program for Armenia, which is something pretty new in Armenian politics.
And no, I mean, it's huge. And Georgia, which is like next door, has been trying to join the EU for like quite a while and sort of got invaded for it and for wanting to join NATO. Armenia was not showing so much enthusiasm. So what's causing this shift?
Yeah, so it's really something that's come about in like the last year or 2 years. Basically, post-independence, Armenia, very much opposite to Georgia, was pretty solidly within the Russian sphere of influence, right? So it's a member of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is like this NATO ripoff with like a couple of post-Soviet states that Russia created.
No, Nick, we don't call it ripoff, we call it a dupe. Fashionable girlies call it a dupe.
Well, whatever you want to call this, like failing organization that's never done anything, the CSTO. It also, basically built Russia out to be its primary political ally, military ally, and trading partner. So this has not been a part of Armenian politics. Any interest in the European Union has not been a major thing in Armenia since 91. Basically, in the last 3 years, as Armenia lost these successive battles with Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh, this territory that Armenia and Azerbaijan have been fighting over for however many decades you want to count, the Armenians basically saw Russia being incredibly inactive, in some ways allowing Azerbaijan to have these intense victories in Nagorno-Karabakh. And it provoked a lot of rage and a reassessment in Yerevan as to their relationship with Moscow. And since you've seen people in the governing party and a whole host of elites sort of reaching out to Europe and the United States, right before Biden exited the White House, Armenia actually signed a strategic partnership agreement with the United States. They've also been in visa liberalization talks with the EU for a little while.
All right. That sounds cool. And especially because I know that there's quite a very close connection between France and Armenia because of just how many Armenian refugees came to France throughout many decades following the Armenian genocide. But isn't Armenia like stuck in a similar conundrum as many other states who, want to join the EU, like Georgia or those in the Balkans, but, have a lot of issues externally or internally that prevents them or slows down their sort of stroll along the path?
So in the Armenian context, it's really complicated, more so than other ones. So not only does Armenia have all the typical issues that any country that wants to join the EU usually has, like corruption or rule of law or anything like that. Since 1991, it has interwoven its economy and energy infrastructure with Russia. So even though Armenia has done things like working to leave the CSTO or getting rid of some of the Russian troops who have been within Armenian territory since independence, there's other things like the fact that Gazprom owns all of the gas infrastructure in Armenia, right? And that Armenia cooperates with Russia on nuclear energy stuff. Like all of the energy in Armenia, they need Russia to keep it running. And again, I think what the EU has shown with countries like Serbia and Georgia, you can't balance anymore. Like post-2022 invasion of Ukraine, the EU has taken a tougher line on this. They're not really going to tolerate any, balancing act. It's going to be one or the other. One of the biggest issues for Armenia is the Eurasian Economic Union, which they are still a member of. And conceivably, this would be a no-go for the European Union as well. If you want to be in the EU, you would have to leave the Eurasian Economic Union. And the Armenians have not taken a strong stance on whether or not that's going to happen.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it because, Armenia doesn't have the kindest, it doesn't live in the kindest neighborhood, right? It's right next door to Georgia, which is, as our listeners, if they've listened to our previous episodes before, is going through its own troubles and is shifting toward Moscow. Next door, you have Turkey. So, you can imagine what that's like. That's sort of like Russia and Ukraine. You have Azerbaijan, also like Russia and Ukraine, and Iran. What steps will Armenia have to take to kind of liberalize itself of Russian influence? It would involve some sort of repairs of its relationship with Turkey and Azerbaijan, right?
So yes, an important thing to understand is that even though Azerbaijan retook all of Nagorno-Karabakh in 2023 and displaced the ethnic Armenians there, the conflict in terms of the dispute over territory is basically over. There is still an ongoing negotiation between Yerevan and Baku in order to fully normalize relations, to open the borders, to get trade going, and conceivably even allow Armenia to switch from buying Russian gas to supplementing that with Azerbaijani gas and energy, because energy is a huge component of this. And the Kremlin is really good at weaponizing energy. The government in Armenia, run by Pashinyan, has basically accused Azerbaijan of stymieing this process, of not really engaging in a productive way. But Yerevan has really been putting in a lot of work for over a year now to normalize relations with both Azerbaijan and Turkey in order to open those borders, to get the economy rolling, and really to be able, in a sort of really significant way, pivot away from Moscow's economic and energy power over Armenia.
Kind of the last question before we switch on to the next topic, but I recall that early on when this idea of normalizing relations between Ankara, Yerevan, and Baku was even floating around on the streets of Yerevan, there were mass protests by members of the public who were kind of viewing it as an act of betrayal by Pashinyan. So how is the Armenian public reacting to all of this? Do you know anything about it?
I do. Buckle up. It's a very complicated
Oh my
issue.
God. What is not complicated in the Caucasus? What is not complicated, my dude?
Unfortunately, Armenia does not have a strong authoritarian state that can just squash any and all public criticism. So they actually have to deal with it.
Sorry, did you just say unfortunately?
Well, comparatively, in terms of Pashinyan getting his program done, from his perspective, maybe.
Oh, please, listeners, we're not officially backing authoritarians. Please. We're pro-democracy here.
So basically, yes, you're correct in that there have been really big protests against Pashinyan. You have to understand, in the Armenian context, it is not as if there's been some mutual recognition where people came together and agreed to put aside differences and move to a brighter future. They lost the conflict, and they lost brutally, right? And so it's a hard sell to make to the public that, oh, now we're going to open our borders to this country we've been in conflict with for decades, when there's zero trust built up between the two. You add into that the fact that Azerbaijan has not changed its rhetoric since 2023, right? There are still very hostile statements being made by leading Azerbaijani policymakers.
Yeah, I mean, hasn't there been also like some hostile statements made like as recent as a couple days ago, even following like the shutdown of the Azerbaijan Airlines aircraft? I think I saw in the headlines that Aliyev was going out and attacking Armenia again.
I would not be surprised if that was true. I don't know the specific incident you're talking about, but things like that happen a lot. But the important thing to really understand is that, one, Pashinyan isn't up for re-election for another 2 years. There are going to be no national elections in Armenia for a while. And then secondly, the opposition in Armenia is kind of non-existent. Like, basically, Pashinyan swept to power in 2018 on this really big sort of public surge against the incumbent party, which was consolidating a sort of quasi-authoritarian regime. It was very popular when he took over. It's a similar situation to Georgia, where the opposition that does exist is very fractured and small. Now, Georgia's opposition has actually rallied together very effectively, I think, in the past year or two. But in Armenia, it's a much worse situation. There is no viable alternative political party to Pashinyan's civil conflict party. There was this very charismatic bishop, actually, who emerged in last spring.
A bishop?
Yeah, Golistin, I think was his name. But here's the catch with Golistin. He might have been able to challenge Pashinyan, but he has Canadian citizenship. So under the Armenian constitution, dual citizens can run for office, I believe. So even him, he was sort of the biggest potential, but he hasn't really been doing anything for the last few months. So Pashinyan is pretty securely in control for the moment. Another issue is that Azerbaijan is insisting that for a final peace process, for a final peace agreement, they want the Armenians to change their constitution. Because Aliyev argues that there's language in the Armenian constitution that claims Nagorno-Karabakh, which is like kind of the case, but also kind of not the case. It's disputable. The catch there is that in order for the constitution to change, there would need to be a public referendum, which not only will take a bunch of time, there's a lot of reason to think it would not pass. So it's a very complicated subject. Armenian domestic politics are kind of crazy right now. But basically the TLDR of it is that Pashinyan is in control domestically. There's a lot of factors complicating his program that he wants to push.
Yeah, I mean, not to mention the costs of running any sort of public vote. I mean, elections are expensive. Now imagine the costs of printing everything. But let's move on to the next topic, because we have something that's actually very close to my heart. You have like one more topic before we get to the guests today. So what else that is hot, boiling, sizzling, and smelling good, or maybe bad, did you bring to the table today?
Okay, so you are not an American citizen, right, Kat?
No.
I'm trying to see if Elon Musk is both of our shadow presidents or just my shadow
let's
president.
Let's put it that way. I pay taxes there, so
okay.
It's already painful enough. But no, not. Look, if I was an American citizen, my life would be a gazillion times easier. Unfortunately,
I'm from New York, so maybe you have like South Brooklyn citizenship situation.
I think South. Yeah. I mean, you could say South Brooklyn,
Brighton, Coney Island.
No, Brighton at this point is
Beachhead.
like no. Brighton at this point compared to when we first came there, it's like pretty. I'm gonna say that the word that some people hate, gentrified. It's gentrified quite a bit compared to that. But let's put it. No, I would actually say Penn Station. Specifically, Penn. If anyone's ever been to Penn Station, it feels like you're in a lobby of like a player versus player game and you're just trying to survive. That's the kind of situation I'm in. So our new shadow president, nonetheless,
Gotcha.
Elon Musk, what about him?
Okay, so as we all know, Elon Musk likes to rule by decree on Twitter, in addition to proposing legislation there by way of Twitter polls and a whole variety of things. And one thing that caught my eye over the last weekend was Elon Musk retweeting an account that I had not heard of that accused a variety of publicly funded international news agencies funded, again, publicly by the US government. The tweet labeled them far left state media and called to shut them down, retweeted them, and he said, yes, shut them down. And the three reasons he listed, and I should probably mention to clarify that these media outlets include Radio Free Europe and Voice of America. So Elon says that, yes, they should be shut down. Because one, he says Europe is now free, which I guess he does not know that Radio Free Europe covers Russia, Georgia, Central Asia, and a variety of unfree places.
Well, Musk only does research by sharing far-right accounts that apparently always end up being run by either some dude in India or some dude from Malaysia that talk about making Europe white again. So I don't know.
That's true. 2, he says nobody listens to them anymore, which seems to not understand that Radio Free Europe is not primarily radio, it's primarily written. And then 3, he says that it's just a bunch of radical left crazy people talking to themselves while torching $1 billion a year of taxpayer money. Now, I actually know people who work at Radio Free Europe and Voice of America, and I can confirm for our listeners that they are not radical left crazy people. They're like incredibly well-informed, lifelong journalists and scholars.
I know people there who like vote Democrat, who vote Republican. I frequently watch Voice of America, like the Russian version of Voice of America. And I was always curious to see kind of the way in which they cover elections, BLM protests. And I always found them to be actually very, very neutral because their whole job as Voice of America is not to present America in a shitty light. And of course, I'm certain I can't speak for Voice of America in, let's say, other languages because, again, I watch it. There's also not just Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, but there's also, it's only in Russian called Настоящее время, meaning like current time. There's also current time. And I mean, when it comes to specifically like Voice of America and current time in Russian, I always found their coverage to be, very respectful because they know that America is the hand that feeds them.
Well, the whole point of these organizations additionally is that they were all started in like the late 1940s, early 90s as America's sort of like soft power news agency. And back in the day, literally broadcasting over radio signals into Soviet occupied Europe, broadcasting anti-communist and pro-American and pro-West messages. It's not as propagandistic as that these days, but still, the overall slant is in a pro-American, pro-human rights, pro-democracy direction, which maybe tells you a little something about where Elon Musk's interests lie. But if that's not crazy enough, Kyrgyzstan's president, Sadir Japarov, who is basically always happy to shutter critical media, responded to Musk's comment supportively, saying that RFE and others, quote, spread false information, look for negativity, and undermine the reputation of others. And that if the U.S. government, quote, don't know where to spend money, give it to us, the state directly. We will ensure democracy and human rights at the highest level. So there you have it.
Right.
Yeah, you have Sadir Japarov. He says we can trust him with democracy and human rights at the highest level. But to quote a friend of mine who actually does live and work in Kyrgyzstan, he recommended that if we wanted to learn about Sadir Japarov, we could check out a website called Human Rights Watch. He said that would be a good place to learn about Japarov. So I don't exactly know if I trust him to replace RFE and VOA. And really, if like, again, we're living in crazy times in DC, like reliable, stalwart institutions are being ripped up. And if Radio Free Europe or Voice of America disappear, it would actually be like a very serious loss, not only for the region, but for people like myself who work in the research community here in DC and really do rely on them. I'll also say I heard from a friend of mine who works at RFE that RFE has very strict rules about reporting on itself. Like RFE is not allowed to talk about the funding for RFE, debates around it or anything like that. So they can't even advocate for themselves due to their own strict rules at this moment. So if any of our listeners have large social media followings or any influence at all, it would be great to advocate for RFE. They're an amazing institution. They do good work.
Yeah, I mean, the importance of these agencies goes back decades. And even I remember that my dad would tell me that as a kid, he would try to hijack the radio he had at home to listen to the Polish version of Radio Free Europe because he lived in Lviv in Western Ukraine. So he did have access to, if he tweaked the radio enough, he would be able to catch signals of Radio Free Europe. So moving on to a topic that I don't know if it's more or less sexy. Nick, what do you think? You're looking at the script, so...
I don't think there's literally anything sexier than Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, but that's just me.
Okay. We listen and we don't judge. Usually I say the unhinged stuff on the podcast. So let's turn to our main topic of the day. A little bit worried for Armenia, a little bit worried for Georgia. We have another country we've been worried about since 2014, but especially so after 2022, Ukraine, who we've mentioned before, but, today's a special episode. So let's turn to this main topic. So less so the security summit in Munich, but everything else that has been going around Ukraine and said security summit, namely the announcement by President Trump, that his colleagues will begin working on a first bilateral meeting between the U.S. and Russia in Saudi Arabia. Let's begin with how all of this started, because it's quite complicated. So this week, the week of February 13th, two major events took place. The NATO summit in Brussels and the Munich Security Summit in Munich. What could have been a normal kind of boring set of meetings between the big boys turned into a set of honestly devastating blows for Ukraine. The first blow was the announcement by Pete Hegseth, that the U.S. Defense Secretary, that a return to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders was unrealistic. Good thing at least we're not talking about pre-2022 borders. Second was the announcement that Trump and Putin have both spoken to one another, bypassing Zelensky. This is the first time that Washington and Moscow have spoken directly with each other since the full-scale invasion, and the American president remarked that he had a good conversation with Putin, noting that the latter even used his campaign motto of quote-unquote common sense. Although, if anything, I don't believe Putin said this out of some desire for genuine peace, considering that at the time of us writing the script and the recording, there was first off a missile flying in direction of Odessa. There's also the air raid alerts. Different cities got bombed left and right. And the Russian government also rejected any offers to give up occupied territory in return for Kursk, which is occupied by Ukraine. Just reminded me how well the Russian government is able to sort of soothe Trump's ear by telling him the things he wants to hear. The third blow was the remark by Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary General, who remarked that it has never been agreed that whenever peace talks would start, these peace talks would end definitely with a NATO membership. This caused a slight gasp among the members of the crowd, and he followed this with, "What I consistently have said is we have to make sure that whatever the outcome is, we have to make sure that Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin will never ever try again to attack Ukraine. That is critical," unquote. Okay, Ukraine was invited to NATO. Let's ignore that. But why the hell are we using patronyms here? What is with this Vladimir Vladimirovich, this sudden, where's all the memory of Putin as a war criminal? And suddenly we're using patronyms and throwing out these extra layers of respect. I'm not sure what's going on. And all of this definitely became music to the ears of Russian officials. Dmitry Medvedev, full-time alcoholic and part-time politician, ex-president of Russia between 2008 and 2012, posted on his Telegram that, quote, "Europe's time is over," unquote, after it was uncovered that European officials were not warned about the call between Putin and Trump, adding that Europe is mad with jealousy and rage. In an interview with Sky News, Penny Mordaunt, former Secretary of State for UK Defense, did remark from her talks with members of the US administration that the latter recognized that Russia is a threat, but want the Europeans to take the lead in supporting Ukraine, including deploying European forces to bolster European defense. Trump also added that he wants European states to spend not 2, not 3, but 5% of their GDP on defense. The question I have, one which I'm thinking the answer to is no, is whether Europe will be ready to commit to all of this. For years now, ever since Trump's first election, politicians and experts alike were all remarking that Europe needs to bolster its defense and national resilience, and yet nothing's happened. With this complicated story, I decided to speak with Anton Shekhovtsov, a Ukrainian writer, political scientist, who has been an outspoken voice both online and amongst his colleagues in highlighting Russian malign influence in Europe and the need to bolster Ukrainian resistance. So, on that note, here's our talk. Hi, Anton. Thank you so much for coming here on this very, very busy Friday. I know you're full of work, but you decided to dedicate us a little bit of your time.
Hello, Ekaterina. Thank you for having me.
Anton, let's look at what happened in the last couple of days, right? You have Pete Hegseth. He kind of arrives, says all of these, very loud, provocative remarks, unsettles a lot of people, says that restoring pre-2014 borders is unrealistic, and it draws a wave of criticism. So it's been about a day and a half since all of these remarks, on top of the announcement by Trump that he spoke with Putin and Zelensky. Yet there's already been sort of a lot of take-sees, back-sees. They seem to be finding out that Russia isn't making it easy to sit down and have a chat with them. How are you perceiving the news of all of this?
Well, first of all, I should say that some of the things that were said by the representatives of the new Trump administration, they are not surprising, they're not new. For example, the statements or arguments that it's very difficult, if not impossible, for Ukraine to take back territories occupied by the Russians since 2014 with military means. It's really difficult. Probably there were some hopes for the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023. Those hopes did not really materialize. So this is in a sort of a consensus in the West that Ukraine at the moment, or short to mid-term perspective, is not capable of taking back the occupied territories. Another statement that sort of upset some of the observers, including observers in Ukraine, is those comments about NATO membership, that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO in short to mid-term perspective. This is not surprising. We see that there is no consensus on NATO membership for now, at the moment, among European leaders as well.
So would you sort of say that in reality, there's nothing that's particularly surprising, that sort of America is just laying out things the way it is and saying the quiet part out loud?
Exactly. And this is not only related to Ukraine, but you see this difference in how Democrats, the U.S. Democratic Party, and the Republican Party, how they are talking about complex things. Democrats, they are sort of muddying the waters, and they try to, be as general as possible, saying things like support for Ukraine as long as it takes, without detailing exactly what it takes and how long until what. While Republicans are being honest. Yeah, they are voicing things that are of a certain consensus, whether one likes it or not. What was surprising for me, and it is still surprising, is a mess. Is this confusion with various signals sent from the Trump administration to Ukraine, to Russia, and to the EU concerning the war. And these are mixed signals. Sometimes they contradict each other, and I cannot understand why there is such a situation where we cannot distinguish between statements from the Trump administration, which are important, and those which are not really important. So we still don't know who exactly in the Trump administration actually has a power to say things which are probably just can be dismissed, or some statements that cannot be dismissed and are actually very significant. We still don't know this because we still getting used to the new administration.
Yeah, actually, on that note, I kind of had a question about sort of the Ukrainian response, right? So Zelensky, he stated this morning that Ukraine, or rather he, does not see a ready U.S. plan. There was also, I was watching Sky News, and they interviewed members of I think it was Sky News, and they interviewed members of the public on the streets of Kiev who kind of also showed quite a bit of distrust toward everything that's going on. In general, a lot of uncertainty, right? Can you try to give us an insight what complaints Ukraine has? So one of them you kind of already brought up, which is uncertainty, right? It's like one thing initially, then it's another. What else?
I think from the Ukrainian side, in general, essentially with all these talks and talks about negotiations and various plans and perspectives, there is one thing which is of crucial importance for Ukraine. These are security guarantees. This is, it starts with security guarantees and it all ends with security guarantees. Ukraine needs those guarantees in order to survive, but also to develop as a modern democratic nation. So, of course, Zelensky is right that he has not yet seen any plan because it doesn't exist. This plan does not exist. This is very clear, and this maybe explains the mess that we are seeing today. All those mixed signals. Zelensky is yet to talk to the representatives of the Trump administration. He still needs to see what they have in mind, at least what sort of, not necessarily a plan, but what sort of list of questions they want to bring to the table, to the negotiations table with Russia.
So, with all of this, what do you think is the talk? Well, not at this point on Bankova, because all of Bankova right now is in München. For the listeners who don't know, Bankova is like the street / a general name for the area where you have the location of a variety of government buildings, including the parliament and the president's office. So with all of this going on, what do you think will be the next moves for the Ukrainians? What moves could they pull to leverage the situation in their benefit? What can they offer, and what will they fight for in terms of these demands?
As I mentioned, for Ukraine, security guarantees is the founding stone of all negotiations. Maybe you can, argue you're going to negotiate many other things, but you can't negotiate. I mean, basically, you can't have a compromise on security guarantees.
But 1 second, Anton, let me get more precise. So security guarantees, one of them is NATO membership, right? In what way do you think Ukraine, if NATO membership in an immediate term is off the table, what immediate security guarantees could Ukraine potentially argue for? Forcing, for example, the British, not forcing, but demanding that British and European troops are on its soil, maybe some sort of quasi-alliance with the West. I want to dig more into that.
Earlier today, Zelensky said that Ukraine would need around 110,000 military personnel. But he also says that those could be Ukrainian military staff. It's just they need advanced weapons. They need the skill. Yeah, if Ukrainian soldiers can present those skills, this is fine. Yeah, but those can be also foreign officers and soldiers. Zelensky is quite ambivalent on this. I presume that he has also, received signals from countries such as the UK, right? Maybe also countries such as France, that there is a possibility, a potential that military personnel from those countries could be part of the international military personnel in Ukraine. But also think that security guarantees from the US are very important. And Zelensky, again, he means the equipment. He means weapons, advanced weapons, not just something that the US could send just, for Ukraine to survive, but actually to be a credible deterrent against further Russian aggression. I wanted to add, actually, I don't know if that's, part of this, but also the news today is that no representative of the Russian government has been accredited to the Munich Security Conference.
Yeah,
This came as a twist. No visas were issued. Of course, they can enter without a visa, I think. It means that either they come and not accredit, so it's going to happen somewhere in a Munich pub, or somewhere else. So it's a very bizarre situation. And I'm sure that because of those symbolical meaning of Munich and Munich Agreement of 1938 and all Munich betrayal, the Germans no longer want Munich as a word associated with something that can be considered as a betrayal of European interests. So actually, this Munich Security Conference may not bring anything, in fact, in all these talks and all these ideas about negotiations between the US, Russia, and Ukraine, maybe the EU as well.
Speaking of Russia, let's jump across the border. So I want your take on kind of what do you think Russians are interpreting all of this as? There's kind of mixed interpretations. On one side, you have Medvedev, who is kind of the chief alcoholic part-time politician, as I call him, who is running around and saying, yeah, everything's great. But you also have Trump, who kind of says, well, we're going to keep supplying Ukraine with weapons because Putin, otherwise, if we stop supplying weapons, will turn around and say, I've won. They haven't sent representatives out of Russia, and they keep on bombing Ukraine. So do you think these actions by Russia will show to Americans what Russians really think about peace talks?
I think Moscow will just continue warfare. There is no reason for Moscow to stop the offensive. There's zero reasons to do that. What could be negotiated first, that would be a ceasefire. But it has to be negotiated. What may happen at Munich is coming up with an idea where exactly those negotiations could take place. And Russians, they will bring the same ultimatum that they had at the end of 2021. This is withdrawal of American troops from Central Eastern Europe. This is the neutral status of Ukraine and, Russian language in Ukraine, all the points that they had in the ultimatum. I mean, they did not nullify that ultimatum. It still stands. So they will bring all of this. This whole configuration is, for me, is a case of concern, because Russians are gods of negotiations. They are super qualified to talk and talk and talk. They have strategies of negotiations. And however Trump can boast about his fantastic deal making, I think that all those skills that he has, and maybe some others in his environment have, they all pale before the skills that the Russians have when they negotiate, and they will send some of their best negotiators. And I'm not sure that that the Americans can send counterpart that will be as qualified to negotiate as the Russians.
There's actually a book called, I have it lying around somewhere, called Kremlin School of Negotiation, which talks about the way in which Russian officials can, negotiate better deals for themselves without you even realizing it. So let's switch to kind of the final player before sort of hearing your final take on all of this. I want to turn to the European continent, both as EU members and as European members of NATO. So Pistorius, he remarked that the U.S. approach of dealing with Russia and taking off the table Ukrainian NATO membership is a mistake. But let's recall that Germany, alongside a couple other countries, for years were hesitant to be more proactive regarding Ukrainian, or for example also Georgian, a NATO or even EU membership. Do you think America's actions will turn Europe into a more proactive player?
President Macron recently said in an interview that the Trump administration, or the actions of the Trump administration as of recent, were like an electroshock for the EU. But when I heard this phrase electroshock, I was thinking that Europe is almost like dead, and you have to revive Europe through electricity. This ancient means of reviving a corpse. All those calls for Europe to wake up, I've heard them since 2014, at least. I think some of my senior colleagues maybe had heard them even earlier. The thought about the first Trump administration, was that it was an aberration. Yes, and there is a little bit of worry for the EU, but there is nothing really to worry about, and there is nothing that would really wake Europe up. Although already the Obama administration was quite clear that the focus for the US was shifting towards China, towards other places of the world. So I don't know what is needed to wake up Europe. It's like on this snooze loop. I know what can be what steps can be taken. I just don't see that Europeans in general, I'm not talking about particular states, but in general, are taking the situation seriously. There are reports, most recently from the Danish Defense Security Intelligence Services, saying that Russia is getting ready for an attack against NATO. It will be ready in 5 years. But in Europe is lagging behind, not only on its own security, on its own security. And I'm not even talking about only military security, but also energy security and also information security. Some things that probably are not that as difficult as the military security. Europe is lagging behind in technology. It's lagging behind in some areas of the future, like AI. And now I hear statements coming from the European leaders that Europe should be at the negotiation table when it comes to the talks on the war against Ukraine. But honestly, what prevents Europe to do more in order to be a significant stakeholder, a significant player in those negotiations?
Let's wrap up with some final thoughts. There's a lot of worry. You don't have to look far. I mean, you and I both speak Ukrainian and Russian, and all it takes is for you and me to look at social media and see kind of the worry expressed by Ukrainians and expressed actually by many Russians who support Ukraine, who feel that Ukraine is being wronged. Is Ukraine approaching some dangerous times, or could there be light at the end of the tunnel?
In the current situation, I remain cautiously optimistic about what can be done in the year 2025. But this also means that there are, of course, dangers for Ukraine, credible threat to Ukraine's independence and sovereignty. And, this threat does not go away. What I fear is that maybe I will somehow repeat myself, but I have a huge concern about psychological preparedness of the US team to hold negotiations with Russia. I think the preparedness on one side, on the other side, they're not equal. One, I think, of the concerns is that I think a couple of weeks ago, we heard that Kellogg, Trump's representative on the issues related to Russia and Ukraine, he said, yeah, of course, the settlement of the war will not take place in 24 hours. Yeah, as Trump mused during his presidential campaign, he said, yeah, it will take several months. And after those words, Ukrainians were, sort of a bit encouraged, because they realized, yes, of course, if you want to solve the war in 24 hours, from the American side, you can easily do this by just, cutting all support to Ukraine and lifting the sanctions against Russia. And this is done. Russia wins. Yeah. So 24 hours. Yeah. The war is over. Yeah. There will be some, guerrilla warfare in Ukraine, but still the war is over. And when Kellogg started talking about several months, it means that Americans were taking the situation seriously. So the concern now is that suddenly these whole developments started to just, taking up speed. And there is no rational explanation why this is happening, or why the name of Kellogg disappeared from some of Trump's statements regarding the negotiations between Russia and the US. So this is the concern, whether they want now to are they still being serious about the settlement of this issue, or they want to do it fast? Fast is bad. Fast is bad for Ukraine. Fast is bad for Europe. In the mid to long-term perspective, it's also bad for the US. And it's always good for Russia. So this is a concern. But I'm still, despite all of this, I'm being cautiously optimistic. I think that it's very important to see the reactions of the Americans when they make more or less significant and substantiated contact with the Russian team. And let's see. This is not catastrophic. I don't see catastrophe here. What's important is to see what Russians bring to the negotiation table and how the Americans will respond. This will be the beginning of more or less clear understanding what is going on.
I guess we can say there is a very small light, just a ray of light peeking through the tunnel. Alrighty. On that note, Anton, thank you so much for coming, and we'll happily have you back in the near to medium to long-term future.
Thank you very much, Katerina, for this conversation.
Alrighty, Anton, thanks for speaking with us. Now let's switch actually to our first in-studio, although it's, recorded remotely, but regardless, our first studio guest, a great friend and an expert of his own caliber himself, Ryan McBeth. Ryan is an intelligence analyst, programmer, ex-soldier, and a YouTuber who frequently discusses all matters military. Thank you so much for coming here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with your interpretation. What has been happening in the last few days? How do you think all of these news will impact military aid given to Ukraine? Is it all over, or is there light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, so that all depends. I mean, right now, the United States really needs to pivot towards the coming China threat, and that is where most of our military is focused right now. So essentially, what Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said a couple of days ago was Europe, listen, you guys need to step up to the plate. If you want to take care of the Ukraine problem, you can take care of it. We're not going to stop you, but we're not going to send our own soldiers. And we need to start getting ready towards China and the China threat. Now, one interesting thing is that when it comes to China, the United States knows that China can be deterred by standing with Ukraine. So I could easily see a situation where the United States continues to send its old weapons and its munitions that are about to expire to Ukraine to reinforce their positions, while simultaneously getting rid of all of the old stuff that's in our inventory to make room for the new stuff that we have to buy. Remember, things like rockets actually expire, and it's more expensive to have them destroyed than it is to actually shoot them.
Ryan, I'm curious to bring it back to Ukraine and sort of the political element of all of this. Trump is often talked about as sort of a deal maker, right? This is the name of his book and everything like that. How do you think the Ukrainians can sort of try to leverage themselves into a better position re the United States? And we've heard discussions over critical minerals, which has a sort of set of issues attached to it. But do you see any other ways the Ukrainians could sort of try to make themselves more relevant to Trump and improve their position?
Well, ideally, the mineral thing where Ukraine gives rare earth metals to the United States as part of the deal, and also as a collateral for any kind of lend-lease program that we might undergo with Ukraine, that would be ideal. But also, just having a couple of Ukrainian counterattacks that are successful, that could move the needle as well. Everybody loves a winner. And to kind of use a football analogy, America likes to be on the side of the winning team.
And it's funny you say sort of everybody likes a winner. I think it's worth mentioning that Trump in particular is well known for liking winners, and maybe more than not liking winners, for hating losers. And, you know, that in his mind, that's the worst thing one can be. So your point is well taken on that.
Well, speaking of winners and losers, since, it's not only Trump that Ukraine sort of has to impress with these small victories that you just mentioned, Ryan, but also the people working alongside him. I was just curious. Some of the people appointed by Trump who are working alongside him or for him directly in his team, they've been accused of having close ties with the Kremlin in some capacity, like Tulsi Gabbard, who is now the director of national intelligence. So sort of two questions within one. With the announcements made by Pete Hegseth, is this a sort of an isolationist approach now taken by the administration, as some people are writing? And is the transatlantic partnership, the Five Eyes and so on, is it all at risk and ripping at the seams considering the type of individuals appointed by the current administration?
Well, to start, I would say that Tulsi Gabbard doesn't necessarily have close ties with Russia, although she does tend to repeat Russian talking points. That might not necessarily be something she believes in, but it's something that gets her on podcasts, right? So sometimes it makes sense to have a sort of iconoclastic view, because who's going to get on a podcast? The guest that's controversial, or the guest that says things that maybe some of the public want to hear. So there is that. Now, when it comes to isolationism, the U.S. has been carrying NATO for quite a long time now, and there are some European countries that haven't necessarily paid their fair share, and that kind of angers President Trump. But when it comes to actual isolationism, the United States is focusing on Taiwan and China threatening to attack Taiwan, which President Xi has told their army to be ready to do by 2027. And if I were China, I would seriously consider invading Taiwan in either March or October of 2028, because that is when there is an American election cycle, and that's when the sea states are best for actually invading. So I don't really view this as an isolationist stance. The United States can only focus on certain regions. And right now, a lot of our dollars are going towards pivoting toward the Pacific.
So just to expand a little bit more on what exactly the GOP is right now. Again, this like historically very internationalist, foreign policy hawk party, the party of Reagan and all that. And we've already mentioned Tulsi Gabbard, but there's also a whole number of highly influential people in the new White House who maybe you couldn't call them isolationists necessarily, but they're certainly not hawks against Russia. But at the same time, especially in the Congress, you still do have these people who talk a big game when it comes to foreign policy issues. So this would be, best embodied by somebody like Congressman Joe Wilson, who's very active on the Helsinki Committee and has introduced a whole series of measures to support Ukraine, and also has very strong relationships with the Georgian opposition. So how do you see the GOP sort of balancing these two wings?
So I think that one of the common factors among all U.S. politicians is that many of them understand that the best way to deter China from invading Taiwan is to support Ukraine, because if we can't support Ukraine that has a rail line connecting it to Poland, we're certainly not going to support a country that is 6,100 miles away from the United States, roughly 10,000 kilometers. So the actions that we perform in Ukraine will reflect on China's decision on whether or not to invade Taiwan. We're also gaining a fantastic amount of data on weapons performance, especially the Patriot missile, the Javelin missile, HIMARS missiles, what works and what doesn't. And Ukraine has been very useful when it comes to gathering that information under real-world conditions, which, again, is all stuff that we're going to have to use if deterrence fails and China invades Taiwan. Now, when it comes to some people supporting, not necessarily supporting Russia, but interested in non-interventionist foreign policy, I think a lot of that comes from some Americans who served in the military and then went on to Congress, who didn't feel the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were handled correctly by the previous administrations. And that left the idea of an endless war as just a bad taste in their mouth. And there's other politicians whose constituents have been infected by Russian propaganda. Remember that Russia believes in multi-domain warfare. And one domain of warfare is information domination warfare. If they use information warfare to convince the average American that Ukraine is corrupt and these rounds, these artillery rounds, are actually ending up in Mexico in the hands of the cartel, well, that doesn't cost as much, and you're not actually performing a kinetic strike, but the effect is the same. That's one of the reasons I've always said that information war is a weapons effector, no different than a cruise missile.
It's a lot to think about in, not just, because of the news that are taking place right now, but because of kind of all the emotions that are probably not just within me, but within a lot of people who care about this, who care about Ukraine, and who, are, cautiously optimistic, or in general just cautious about what will happen in the next couple months or weeks. I'm thinking about a remark made by John Bolton. So for the audience who don't know, that's Trump's former national security advisor. He said, quote, "Putin couldn't be happier. I tell you, they're drinking vodka straight out of the bottle in the Kremlin tonight. It was a great day for Moscow," referring to the announcement by Trump that Putin and Trump spoke for an hour and a half. Sort of with this quote and with a remark made by Russia's part-time alcoholic, part-time politician Dmitry Medvedev, who kind of gloated that, Europe's era is over and Russia's, rising up again. How do you think Russians are potentially reacting? Are they as happy as they're pretending to be? Is Bolton right?
So one of the things you have to understand is that John Bolton kind of fell out of favor with President Trump. And I believe John Bolton was one of the architects of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And one of the things that you have to understand is that Russia can't stop this war. So Russia's economy, I think inflation's at about 9% right now. And when it comes to their actual employment, I believe it's 3.5 million people in Russia are actually working in munitions depots or for the defense economy. They're building the weapons and equipment that Russian soldiers need to fight in Ukraine. And the problem is that if there were a ceasefire tomorrow, essentially many of those employees get laid off. And now you have millions of people who are out of work. And if you disband or bring home some of the army, now you have hundreds of thousands of people who know how to use guns and who might not be all that happy that they didn't get to finish the job. Now, granted, acquiring a firearm in Russia is a lot different than it is in the United States. However, this has never stopped rebels from getting guns. And I could easily see President Putin continuing the war no matter what happens at these peace talks, because number one, he hasn't accomplished all of his goals yet. And number two, if he does stop the war, if he doesn't have a soft economic landing, he will end up like Nicholas Ceausescu. I have no doubt in my mind about that.
What do you think will happen if, Russia repeats full-scale invasion 2.0? Because that seems quite scary.
Well, in order for them to do that, it would probably take about 10 or 15 years to get their equipment back up, and they may not have the actual manpower to do so. One common belief among a lot of strategists is that Russia launched this war now because they are in demographic crisis, to the point where if they don't attack Ukraine and start this plan immediately, they're not going to have enough soldiers in the coming years, just because their birth rate is declining. So they might not be able to do this in another 10 or 15 years. And that is probably why they will continue the fight no matter what happens at the peace table.
I'm curious what will happen. Okay, it's probably not going to happen, right away after the potential peace deal is signed. But what could happen if Putin attacks again?
If Russia attacks again, odds are they'll do so with an army that's more knowledgeable, perhaps an army that's more professional, since they've had time to rest and refit, use some of the lessons that they've learned in Ukraine. So odds are they will come back with more advanced equipment, better drones, and a better battle mind, a better mindset to actually fight in Ukraine. What would happen on the Ukrainian side? Well, they would certainly be running into an army that is more professional, has more drones, and probably has more equipment from the West, and most likely better equipment from the West. Like I said, Russia needs to keep attacking, because if they stop, even for a little while, Ukraine is going to turn into a giant porcupine.
And what about the United States?
That's an excellent question. It probably depends on who is in power in the administration. And the United States might be involved with China at that point. So that is a little too murky to give you a good answer on. However, I can say that any activities in China will be a mostly naval fight, whereas any kind of action on the ground in Ukraine would be a mostly land fight. And we are able to fight two wars simultaneously, especially in a situation where most of the Pacific is in the air and sea domain, and most of the European theater is in the land and air domain.
On that note, thank you so much for coming, Ryan. We hope to see you soon enough and talk to you again.
Thank you so much.
Well, that's it for this very dynamic week. Thank you so much for joining us for this week's All Out on the Eastern Front. Thanks again to you, Nick, for jumping in and being a co-host. I know it's kind of not the first time you're jumping onto a podcast, but, you're a full-on host now. As for your real job, unlike, this podcast, where can we find your work?
So my regular writing appears on the Caspian Policy Center's website. That's my 9 to 5 in DC. And then on my personal Substack, you can find my writing. It's called the Eastern Neighborhood Bulletin. And the rest of my stuff I promote on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Do not worry, we will link all of that in the description. So, as for the listeners, if you like what we do, the software we use, and the food for my cat won't pay for itself, so a link to our Patreon page will be provided in the show notes. Links to Nicholas's stuff, Ryan and Anton's socials can be found on there as well. Should you wish to get in touch with yours truly, the hosts, yes, I know Charlie's missing, but she's here in spirit, you can get in touch with us via Twitter at @Eshenhelia or at Hancock2001. Don't worry, if you don't know how to spell this, everything will be in the show notes below. And on that note, we hope to see you next week. Bye now.